Europe accepted a 15% tariff. Japan accepted a 15% tariff. They accepted us taxing our people 15%. They didn't accept paying 15%. We're the ones that are paying it. We're making it seem like they agreed to pay these tariffs. They didn't agree to pay anything. They agreed to let us charge our own citizens 15% to buy their stuff, right? We are the losers in this deal, right? Higher taxes are not a good thing. Now, yes, we have big deficits, and so you can argue we need higher taxes, but that's not what Trump is saying. He's just saying we're getting this money for free. They're talking about rebates. This week they were talking about sending out rebate checks to Americans, tariff rebates, so we can share in the windfall. I mean, talk about picking somebody's pocket. So Trump is reaching in to the average American's left pocket and taking $3,000 out of it. So the tariffs are not going to cause manufacturing to come to the United States because it's still cheaper for Americans to pay the tariffs. So they'll pay the tariffs. But what the tariffs will do is make some current U.S. manufacturing less competitive. And so more of our companies are going to go out of business. And so if Americans want to buy goods, they're going to be forced to buy more imported goods and pay even more tariffs because the tariffs, rather than protecting American industry that doesn't exist, the tariffs are going to harm what's left of American industry that still exists. So you've got the tariffs bad news, you got the jobs news. All of this stuff is weak and is going to be weighing down the U.S. economy. Now, what's going to happen, of course, now is expectations have been raised for a rate cut now in September. And in fact, Trump has already called for what amounts to a mutiny at the Fed because he's got two of his guys who dissented. And this is the first time two people have dissented in 40 years. I forget exactly, but it's very rare. I mean, it's rare to get one dissent.
Recent weak job numbers have reignited speculation about the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates. Political pressure is mounting, particularly from Donald Trump, who has criticized Fed Chair Jerome Powell and is pushing for easier monetary policy. Trump-backed Fed members have already dissented from recent policy decisions, an event so rare it hasn't happened twice in one vote in decades. This political intrusion into the Fed's independence risks undermining public trust. If Powell concedes, it could appear he's bowing to political demands. If he resists, he risks being blamed for any economic downturn, especially as recession warning signs begin to multiply.
Let alone two dissents. But we got two dissents. And so Trump has been saying that the rest of the FOMC should mutiny, right? They should all go against Powell because it's majority rules at the Fed. So if enough FOMC members vote to cut rates, they can override Powell. In fact, one of the other members just announced she was retiring early. So now there's a slot that Trump can fill with another crony, right? So he can put another yes man or gal on the FOMC who can vote to cut rates. So he's actively encouraging a mutiny. So he went out and literally outright fired the head of the Labor Department because the Labor Department came out with bad numbers, and he wants to stack the Fed with his cronies, and he wants mutiny, and he's demanding that Powell cut rates. And of course, he's got to know that Powell's not going to cut rates. And in fact, the more Trump, calls for rate cuts and calls Powell, a moron or a fool or stupid, whatever he's saying, right? The more Trump does that, the harder he makes it for Powell to cut rates, because then it looks like he's caving in. Then it looks like, he doesn't have the independence. Now, the weak jobs numbers, now if Powell comes back and says, the economy wasn't as weak as we thought, But that also undermines the Fed, because is the Fed really just putting everything on these government numbers? I mean, why do we have all these economists that work at the Fed?
The Federal Reserve's credibility is on thin ice. One week, officials claim the economy is strong. The next, they reverse course due to updated government data. This flip-flopping reveals a deeper issue: over-reliance on flawed or incomplete data. Why employ hundreds of economists if policy hinges on potentially inaccurate figures? If the Fed is simply reacting to statistical snapshots without deeper analysis, it's not steering the economy, it's chasing it. This creates uncertainty in markets and undermines confidence in monetary policy. The Fed's erratic messaging on employment and inflation only fuels confusion, destabilizing the very system it's supposed to manage.
If they just look at government numbers, if they just take government numbers, as gospel, and they just build all their policy on these numbers. I mean, I said that before. I said, how could you base policy on numbers that you know are wrong, that you know are going to be revised? So for Powell, at last week, to talk about how strong the economy is, how strong the labor market is, and then at the very next press conference say, hey, the labor market is not strong, it's weak. So we got it wrong because we believed the government. Well, don't you have your own people, right? Didn't you know the government got it wrong? How could you, but there is some excuse. But given the ground that Trump laid out, or Powell rather, his criteria about inflation and making sure that these tariffs don't end up causing higher inflation, which again, they're not going to be the cause, but they could certainly be the excuse that the Fed could use. But I know that prices are going to be moving up as more of the importers start to add on these tariffs. And again, because Trump is imposing tariffs on Americans, no matter where they're getting their goods, right? So whatever we want to import, we're going to have to pay a tariff. So no one country is really at a competitive disadvantage. I mean, you could say maybe Switzerland, because they're 39 versus the EU is 15, right? So that could be problematic for the Swiss. But look, it's a whole world out there that can buy Rolex watches. I mean, it's not like Switzerland's not going to sell any Rolex watches in the United States. They'll sell some. But now they're going to have more Rolex watches to sell in other countries. Now, maybe Rolex prices, new prices, in order for Rolex to move that merchandise, maybe it will cut prices, 5% in Asia. And so Asian consumers will get a break because Americans can no longer afford to buy new Rolexes. They'll sell for less money in other countries, so other people will get a break. Those are the winners. It's not Americans. We don't win. In fact, when I hear these Republicans talking about these great trade deals that Trump has negotiated and we've won, they say, and Europe accepted a 15% tariff. Japan accepted a 15% tariff. They accepted us taxing our people 15%. They didn't accept paying 15%. We're the ones that are paying it. We're making it seem like they agreed to pay these tariffs. They didn't agree to pay anything. They agreed to let us charge our own citizens 15% to buy their stuff, right? We are the losers in this deal, right? Higher taxes are not a good thing. Now, yes, we have big deficits, and so you can argue we need higher taxes, but that's not what Trump is saying. He's just saying we're getting this money for free. They're talking about rebates. This week they were talking about sending out rebate checks to Americans, tariff rebates, so we can share in the windfall. I mean, talk about picking somebody's pocket. So Trump is reaching in to the average American's left pocket and taking $3,000 out of it.
Contrary to political spin, foreign nations aren't paying U.S. tariffs. American consumers are. When a product faces a 15% tariff, the cost is embedded into the final retail price. Whether it's electronics from Taiwan or luxury watches from Switzerland, Americans foot the bill. Even if producers try to absorb some of the tariff, it squeezes their profit margins, leading to layoffs, reduced investment, or price hikes elsewhere. Worse, some Republican leaders tout these tariffs as victories because other nations agreed to them, when in reality they simply allow the U.S. to tax its own people more, This is economic nationalism turned inside out.
And now he wants to take $1,500 and put it in the right pocket so he can take credit for putting $1,500 in without being held responsible for taking $3,000 out. I mean, that's basically what's going on. But of course, Trump can't have his tariff cake and eat it too. He's claiming that the tariffs are going to offset the deficits that are going up based on the big, beautiful bill. He keeps saying, well, Congress isn't counting all this tariff revenue. Well, if he's going to rebate it back to the public, then how can he count it? He can't claim that he's going to use tariffs to reduce the deficits and then also say, well, he's going to rebate the tariffs back to the taxpayer, because you can't do both. Either you reduce the deficit or send out the rebate checks. But, he just wants to act like Americans are benefiting, like he's going to share the wealth that he's created, that he's tapping into, because all the other presidents were too stupid to realize that all they had to do is tax foreigners and we'd get rich. And the foreigners are laughing at us. But because we have imposed these tariffs across the board, then it's not that big a deal to any one country, because they don't have to worry about, I'm going to, maybe Indonesia is worried, we can't sell our stuff because we got a tariff. Well, Thailand's got the same tariff. South Korea got the same tariff. Taiwan's got the same tariff. So all the businesses that compete with those, or India, right? All the business, they all have the same tariff to pass on. So nobody is at a competitive disadvantage. So there's no reason not to pass on the tariff. And the American consumer has no choice but to pay it, because there is no U.S. substitute. The only choice is just not to buy anything and go without.
In a twist of irony, the Trump administration has floated the idea of rebate checks, returning some tariff revenue to consumers as a windfall. But this is economic sleight of hand. Take $3,000 out of the public's pocket in the form of tariffs, then hand back $1,500 and call it a gift? It's nothing more than a political stunt dressed as economic relief. Meanwhile, deficit spending remains sky high, undermining the claim that tariffs are reducing the fiscal shortfall. You can't use tariff revenue to both shrink the deficit and send out rebates. One promise will inevitably be broken.
And that's going to be a choice that a lot of people are going to make. But businesses will have a choice, right? American companies, knowing that their customers are broke, struggling to make their payments, record amount of credit card debt, right? Knowing that their customers are broke, some of the tariffs may not be passed on to the customers. They may be eaten by the businesses. But these are American businesses that are going to have to suffer, right? Their profits are going to be reduced by whatever portion of the tariffs they absorb. And so what negative impact is that going to have on the economy? If companies have lower profits because they have to eat some of the tariffs because their customers can't afford to pay them, well, they have less money available to make capital investments, to grow their companies, to hire more workers. So the tariffs are going to have a negative impact on the economy, especially on the consumer part of it, right? Because that's where they're focused, right? We're making consumption more expensive, right? These are taxes on consumption. They're excise taxes. Now, I prefer these taxes to income taxes, but it's not like we're getting rid of the income taxes. We're just adding the tariffs. I think the average effective tariff rate now is like 18%. This has been the highest rate since the Smoot-Hawley days that preceded the Great Depression. But of course, back then, Americans didn't have Social Security taxes to pay. We didn't have a payroll tax. We had an income tax, but it was only for the very, very rich. Now you have middle-class Americans paying the payroll tax, paying the income tax, and now they're paying these super high tariffs. And that's still not enough, because we still have these huge deficits, which means Americans are going to pay the payroll tax. Could you imagine, what if a governor of a state raised the sales tax way up?
Tariffs are functionally equivalent to sales taxes: indirect, regressive, and quietly punishing. Unlike income taxes, they hit everyone equally, regardless of ability to pay. And unlike 1930s America, today's middle class is already burdened with payroll taxes, income taxes, and rising living costs. Now, with effective tariffs averaging nearly 18%, the highest since the Smoot-Hawley era, consumers are tapped out. Businesses, knowing this, are forced to absorb costs or risk losing customers. The result? Shrinking profits, falling investments, and reduced hiring. Far from being a clever trade strategy, these tariffs are a hidden tax on survival and a drag on the broader U.S. economy.
And then talked about how rich the state was getting on sales tax revenue. Would anybody buy that? Of course not, because the public knows they pay the sales tax, because the sales tax is written on the price. You go and buy something and the sales tax is added on. The tariff is not added on, it's built in, but it doesn't mean you're not paying it, right? Whenever Trump talks about tariff, just talk about a sales tax, because that's basically what it is. It's the same type of tax, right? If you read the Constitution, duties, imposts, excises, all their indirect taxes, right? Tariffs fall in the same category as a sales tax, right? So when the government puts a tax on liquor, federal government puts a tax on cigarettes, federal government puts a tax on anything, same as a tariff. That's what it is. But so the degree of economic ignorance in the administration, all the way to the top, right? Because everybody is singing the same tune when it comes to tariffs. You know, and I still see some of these people defending Trump that I know are free traders, and I hear them on TV, and they try to say, well, you know, yes, I believe in free trade, but I really like the way Trump is using tariffs as leverage to get these great deals. What great deals? He hasn't gotten any great deals, and he's not using the tariffs as leverage because the tariffs are still there. We're imposing all these tariffs, even with countries. When countries agree to go to zero tariffs on American goods, right? No tariffs at all. Not that they had high tariffs before. Maybe they were 3% and they went down to zero because Trump was able to leverage them to go to zero. Trump didn't say, okay, we'll have no tariffs on your goods coming into our country. Trump is at 15% or 20%. So the tariffs are not just leverage. They are being imposed. Trump likes the tariffs. He wants the tariffs. He doesn't just want the threat of tariffs. He wants the reality of tariffs because he doesn't understand them.